CCN's spokesperson on housing, planning and infrastructure. I'm also the leader of Surrey County Council and the chair of Surrey Heartland's health system. We've got an excellent lineup of panelists this morning, including Katrina Riddell, Director of Katrina Riddell Associates, Piers Warburton, who's the Chief Executive of One Powerhouse Consortium, Will Tanner, Director of UK Onward, and James Stevens, the Director of Cities for Cities at the House Builders Federation. So before I hand over to Katrina, though, I'd just like to make a couple of opening comments. I think as we come out of this pandemic, we need to have an absolute focus on how we get the country back on to a long-term and sustainable footing. Economic recovery is an essential part of that, but equally how we rebuild our towns and our communities, not just our high streets. That's a key part of the conversation. Economic strength and growth, as you know, is just one aspect of the wider determinants of health. Where 20% of those determinants are around pure health interventions, 30% broadly around your own lifestyle, what you eat, how you exercise, and so on. But 50%, the other 50% of physical or mental health issues are directly affected by the kind of socio-economic environment. And that includes education, employment, the quality of housing, the affordability of housing, air quality, access to green spaces, and so on. So, whilst it's completely understandable that the government have a very real focus on creating more housing to meet demand, we must ensure that all of those components are part of the planning process. Not surprisingly, health and well-being issues don't stop at district or borough boundaries. So we really need to think of how we can better plan for our communities and for that economic recovery. So the CCN have worked closely with Katrina Riddell to come up with a proposed solution, and then we submitted that alongside our response to planning for the future white paper. And I think above all, there's just one simple message here, that we must have greater collaboration between all of those organisations and authorities, that can deliver those improved outcomes for our residents that I'm sure all of us are very focused on. So let me now introduce you to Katrina. Katrina is a chartered town planner, has over 30 years experience working both for and with local authorities, and provides support on broader planning issues, but specifically on strategic planning. How she does this, but she fits this in, but she's the Vice Chair of the Town and Country Planning Association, a member of the RTPI's England Policy Panel, regular columnist for Planning Magazine, and somebody who is extremely well known across the whole of the industry. So, Katrina, I'm going to hand over to you in the first instance, and then I'll bring in the panelists for a sort of Q&A session afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to hopefully share my screen. Thank you very much, Tim, for the introduction. I'm going to give a quick overview of the proposals that we've set out for strategic planning, and I think it's thanks to the steering group that we had involved in this and to Peter Finch from CCN that we ended up, I believe, with a pragmatic and effective response to filling the strategic planning void that we've had really over the last 10 years. We know that the government are proposing to remove the duty to cooperate, which is what we have been using since 2011, and we know that the government want to do something to replace it with. They recognise the need for some form of mechanism to deal with strategic planning matters, but they've left it sort of open as to what that might be. So CCN asked me to help them fill it, which we have tried to do. It was published in October, so I'm hoping many of you will have had a chance to actually read the report, at least read the summary. So I'm going to try and be very quick in terms of the proposals and why we think this is an effective response to strategic planning. the first thing really is to understand what strategic planning is, and it is much more than just dealing with housing numbers, and actually it's more than dealing with strategic infrastructure. I'm not going to read these out, but I just want to point to a couple of, or three of the really important ones. And one is that strategic planning really is that essential pivot between national and local level. It is there to help deliver national policies and priorities, but to make sure that they also reflect what's happening on the ground, because we don't have a homogenous country, we don't even have homogenous regions. We have very different areas that respond differently and need different interventions and support. So that's its first really important role. The second one is to provide that integrated approach across spatial areas. So to bring in not just the sort of spatial housing issues, as I said, but to deal with economic growth, the environment priorities and the infrastructure priorities, and the social and health priorities. So it's to provide an integrated framework for investment and for long-term planning. And then finally, I'd just like to point to the fact that the obvious one really is that it provides that larger spatial canvas to test and to look at what the best strategic response is to growth, to make sure that growth is directed to the places which will give you, for example, the greatest bang for your buck, so to speak, in terms of jobs and housing, but also where we can avoid the areas that are most sensitive and build places, better places where we can support it with the right infrastructure. So to the proposals, there are four main proposals. The first really is about a new contract between local and central government. We've spent a lot of time over the last few years with local planning authorities trying to justify their new communities, etc., without potentially the support from government agencies, and a real fragmentation in terms of funding for infrastructure. So what we want to do is try and promote and raise awareness around what the value of strategic planning, effective strategic planning is, but actually have a more integrated approach from the national level right down to the local level, from government departments and agencies right across to local authorities. And I always say that place leadership starts at the top of local government. It's not a planning responsibility, it is a leader's responsibility and a chief exec with the chief exec support. So that's the first area that we think there needs some support with, and it's really fantastic to see the Oxford-Cambridge ARC reflect that and reflect actually quite a lot of the proposals we've got in this report. And the second one really is about the mechanisms. And first and foremost, what we've learned over the last 10 years is we need a single accountable body to make some decisions around strategic planning, to make the decisions in the interests of the greater good. And this is really important particularly across two-tier areas, and in some cases three-tier areas now where we've got combined authorities. We need that integration from the top down, from every tier, and we need to respect the fact that planning is, and the statutory planning system is only part of the solution. In two-tier areas, for example, county councils are very responsible for infrastructure, for transport. They are lead flood risk authorities, as Tim has already said. They have public health role. They are really important in terms of supporting long-term place-based growth. So we need a governance structure that reflects the role of all tiers of local government and reflects the key partners that are involved in that as well. So what we've proposed is that we will have probably growth boards or something similar who will have that wider remit around supporting good growth, but they will have a specific role within that, which is strategic planning advisory body. And the reason we felt this was important is around things like housing numbers and funding for infrastructure. It's about providing that really important advisory role to government. There's been a lot of concern about the government's proposals in the planning white paper about the government taking responsibility for setting housing numbers. But if we sort of look back in history, it's only in the last 10 years that has been left to local planning authorities themselves. Up until then, it was the government through regional planning guidance and regional spatial strategies that actually set the housing numbers. The critical issue here was these were informed very much by testing and the advice of local authorities. So they were robust numbers. They weren't just numbers that were based at a national level. They were informed very much from the local level. So we want a strategic planning advisory body role given to these growth boards. And I think that has to have a formal status of some sort. Within all that, we're proposing that you have all local authorities have new powers to support sustainable development. And we know that since 2000, local authorities have powers of wellbeing, but what we want is something more specific, so that every local authority has a role to play in this, and they know what their role is to play in this. And that's something, and I'll talk about this in a minute, that might come further down the line, but it is a really important part of that systemic approach to sustainable growth. It's about everybody playing their part to deliver good growth. And the mechanism for doing all this is an integrated strategic framework, which is based on spatial building blocks. This is a really important part of the proposals because there's been lots of debate about what the right level spatial geography is to do strategic planning. And in my experience, there is no right level. There is no spatial geography nirvana, and it actually operates in different levels. And we'll hear later from the One Powerhouse Consortium about how our proposals could fit with what they are suggesting, which is a much bigger spatial geography. So we are suggesting that we have these essential building blocks. So if you take Surrey, for example, you have a growth board and a framework around Surrey, but that doesn't stop them having being able to work cross borders with, for example, if you know Surrey, Blackwater Valley, but also within the London city region. So you build up these building blocks to focus on the areas, but you have that core building block to manage all the process and the decision making. And then the final part of the sort of system that we're proposing is a strategic delivery plan. And again, that shouldn't wait till we've got the framework. That has to be developed alongside the framework. We have to know at least for the first 10 years where the money's coming from and how it's going to be delivered. And we feel also that the strategic planning advisory bodies could have a role in, for example, recommending to government where locally led development corporations could apply across these areas, as well as the funding streams. And they would have some form of fiscal accountability. I think that's really important. And then finally, two issues around sort of how you take this forward. One is that we know there's a lot already doing something along these lines, so we could test and refine the proposition to make sure it is deliverable and make sure that we're getting different responsibilities at different levels, and that there are adequate resources, and these actually reflect that ringmaster role of strategic planning. Again, it's not about just statutory planning. There are a whole load of disciplines involved in this, and that also reflects the fact that we need some capacity at the county councils, given that the two-tier areas are still very much here, at least for the foreseeable future, and the counties have a huge role to play in this. Moving on to why we think this will be an effective solution. I've set out there just some of the key national priorities, government priorities around delivering sustainable growth, and in there is also the planning reforms, but it's also the commitment around 300,000 new homes, and the various spatial priorities around levelling up and the Oxford-Cambridge Arc. And our proposals fit in with every single one of these, we think. There are a whole load of blockages, and I won't go through these because we've done so much research and there's been so much said about the blockages. We know what the blockages are, but one I would actually say, which this addresses directly, and that is when the strategic planning part of the system was taken out in 2010-11. All the risk, the financial risk and political risk, was delegated to individual local planning authorities. And in many cases in two-tier areas, they are very small and have not moved forward because of the risk that they are having to take. This is about providing a system that shares that risk and shares that responsibility, and takes on some of the real difficult decisions. And again, that's not just fiscal decisions, that is some really difficult political decisions. And we know that there will be changes. We've heard this week there might be changes to the LEPs, and we need a system that can deal with the volatility of different structures as we move forward. And again, our proposals around governance, we feel, are resilient to future changes and can continue to deliver that sort of long-term growth. So we're suggesting an integrated approach that deals with all the different facets of growth, that new relationship between local and central government, making sure that there is an aligned set of priorities and they're clear what everybody at each level is actually doing to support it. Much stronger place leadership, again, sharing that risk, sharing the fiscal responsibilities and making sure all investment priorities are aligned. some stable conditions to deliver long-term growth, but also to deal with the immediate recovery, as Tim has just mentioned. This is about the now as well as the future. This is not about just forward planning. This is about providing a framework that can deal with problems we're facing immediately. It will definitely deliver a faster, simpler, more predictable planning system, which is the overall ambition that the government has for the planning system. It takes, again, some of these risks and difficult decisions further up the chain, and allows the examination process and at the end to move much more swiftly and much more smoothly. So you get local plans in place much quicker. It allows that responsive strategic planning geography to scale up or to scale down depending on the issues, and it allows us to deal with things like city regions, and we know that's an issue, particularly given that most cities in this area are being asked, and large towns being asked to take the bulk of the housing, and the vast majority of them are all surrounded by greenbelt and two-tier areas. So we need the flexibility to be able to scale up and scale down and work with different partners. And this also would allow us to resource a dedicated strategic planning capability and capacity, which has dwindled significantly over the last 10 years. And actually, frankly, since 2004, we've had a significant loss of strategic planners within the system. And as I said, this is not just about the planning profession itself, it is a multidisciplinary task. So just finishing off, one of the really important parts of this is that it can be done now. We can start doing this now. We don't have to wait, and it can evolve over time. Some of these issues will need statutory grounding, so things like the new sustainable powers, the sustainable development powers given to local authorities, but also some of the issues around giving perhaps a statutory role to the strategic planning advisory bodies. But a lot of this could be done now, and that map sort of illustrates the non-statutory frameworks that are being evolved and some of the growth boards that are already in existence across England. And I'm sure you'll see this as a really healthy map. We've got a very, very good foundation to work from. And that was one of the things that sort of made us look at this non-statutory framework approach rather than a statutory part of a statutory development plan, which we know is rigid and inflexible. And we need something more responsive. So we've got the foundations, but we need something that helps deal with these difficult, challenging political issues around housing numbers in Greenbelt. And more importantly, we need something that delivers a single accountable body for each of these areas that can make these difficult decisions and make the decisions in the interest of the greater good and deal with it in a place-based growth approach. We do need some existing model. We've got the existing models to test, and some of that is around what should be prescribed nationally and what should be left to be determined locally. And that's an area that we'd like to explore a little bit more, because it doesn't all have to be dictated from government. And we'd like to sort of make sure that we get that bit right. And we can move forward with some of this now, for example, through government statements, through the national policy framework. We don't have to wait until the legislation around the planning system that the government's promised for later this year. So we're ready to go now. We think it will deliver a really efficient, effective and pragmatic approach to strategic planning and support the growth that this country needs. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Katrina. Really helpful run across what are complicated and detailed issues. But I think that's really helped set the scene. What we're going to do now is go to our three panelists. I would remind you that there will be some time at the end of this, hopefully, to take your questions. So please do put them in the chat, and we'll try and get through as many of those as we can, either giving you answers now or we'll respond in the chat itself. But we've got three panelists. I'll very briefly introduce them. Piers Warburton, the Chief Executive of One Powerhouse Corporation, spent 9 years as a research director for the former Prime Minister, Sir John Major, advising on a whole range of issues, and then indeed held senior positions in a number of different organisations, and as well as advising the partners of Global Infrastructure Partners and the board of Gatwick Airport on the structure and implementation of their campaign for a second runway. Secondly, we have Will Tanner, also an advisor to a former Prime Minister, in this case Theresa May, between 2013 and 17. as a special advisor, and then he's worked for a number of organisations, including Portland and the independent think tank Reform. And then finally, James Stevens, and James is the House Builders Federation Director for Cities, and within that role has responsibility for all matters relating to devolution and the combined authorities in England, where this relates to house building. So it'd be really interesting to hear your perspectives, whether you agree with Katrina or not, and if so, what your proposals, alternative proposals, might look like. So should we start then with Piers? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim, and it's a great pleasure to be with you today. The Powerhouse Consortium, just a little bit of background of where we come into this debate, it's the brainchild of Sir Hugh Sykes, who, as many of you may know, is a retired Sheffield-based businessman who was in charge of the Sheffield Development Corporation in the late 80s, early 90s. The Sheffield Development Corporation was widely regarded as one of the better of quite a mixed bunch of development corporations. And so he brings quite a lot of on-the-ground knowledge to this debate. He has determined that through his charitable foundation, I stress we are an apolitical and philanthropic organization, spatial planning as a discipline is an intensely practical way to address what used to be called the North-South divide and is now called was then called regional inequality and is now called levelling up. The discipline of spatial planning, as most of the people on this call will know, is very well understood, tried and trusted methodology used across advanced democracies and advanced economies, very analogous to our own, particularly the Randstad in Holland, the Rhine-Ruhr in Germany, and the New York metropolitan region, obviously in New York City. What Sir Hugh wanted to do was to show how spatial planning might work for the mega regions of England. Spatial planning is used, as you know, for the home nations in London and has been successful, particularly London and Scotland, but it has not been used for the mega regions of England. And we've chosen the mega regions broadly across the old civil service Bank of England regions. So it's the North, the Midlands, the Southeast, including London, and the Southwest. So we commissioned leading practitioners, globally recognized practitioners, AECOM, Atkins, and Barton Wilmore, to physically prepare draft spatial plans. And they are available to see on our website, Powerhouse Consortium. And we launched those in January of this year. Progress has been a little bit difficult because of first Brexit and then COVID. But the work, whilst a year out of date in a sense, actually it doesn't date because the methodology remains the same. So we now have a completely new set of challenges, of course, through COVID, which Katrina has touched upon. I'm in violent agreement, which is always a bad place to be, with Katrina on this. The only difference, and in fact, our recommendations to government almost precisely mirror Katrina's. That is, our recommendation is that because we've only produced draft spatial plans, clearly they need to be taken to the next level, and that can only really be done by a government department. Sir Hugh might be his charitable foundation is well funded, but it's not that well funded. So our recommendation in the first instance is to have Sir John Armitt and the National Infrastructure Commission take the work forward to the next level. We believe that he's the right person, A, because he's a highly respected man, and B, because infrastructure will probably be the largest, the biggest ticket item in the suite of measures. So we felt that was a suitable place for it to be housed. Alongside that, and very much chiming with Katrina's suggestions, our expression is regional growth boards. The government used the expression pan-regional partnerships. That would be constituted precisely, as Katrina says, through combined authorities, local authorities, LEPs, transport authorities, and relevant health authorities. And possibly APPGs where relevant, although having too many MPs might make a little bit of hard work of things. No disrespect to any MPs on the call. So that growth board or pan-regional partnership would then work with the National Infrastructure Commission to take the work forward so that you, of course, have a local input. That's very, very important. That work is then overseen by either 4 ministers, one for each of the regions, or a single minister. My preference would be for it to be Rishi Sunak or Boris Johnson, thereby representing the centre, because I think it's very important to remember that the centre still plays a very, very important role in regional and sub-regional development. That is something which is never going to go away, and because they have a lot of money to spend as well. So that's our structure, which replicates. The difference, I think, from our work, our vision, and Katrina's is just one of scale. Spatial planning works best when you have that 10 to 15 million population or above. And the regions of mega regions of England broadly, with the exception of the southeast, broadly, if you remove London, it does broadly fit into that sort of population density. The other really big benefit of spatial planning in this instance, which we do differ from Katrina, is that, and this has had a light shone on it very recently, it's the gaps that are the problem. The gaps, but if you want to approach this on a city regional basis, which the government have done for some time, city regions make a lot of sense, but it doesn't solve the problem, A, of competition between city regions within a region, and it also crucially doesn't address the gaps between each city region, which is really where the deprivation is. And our emotional motivation, if you want to call it that, is quite simple. That is that you can't have a child born 25 miles from Doncaster or Redruth or Nottingham with one likely set of outcomes for that child's life, and another child born exactly similar background, similar potential, born 25 miles from London with a completely different set of likely outcomes. It is demonstrably unfair, but it is also a complete waste of human resources. So our hope is that our approach addresses those gaps, is politically pragmatic, and will get to a stage where, because it's evidence-based, it's very hard to argue with. So there will always be competing voices between councils, between combined authorities, between MPs. But if you have a statement of facts, which is broadly speaking what a spatial plan is, i.e. what is there, what needs to be where, it's really hard to argue with. So we hope we're bringing some intense practicality, is how I address it, or focused effort to the really crucial issue of regional inequality, economic development, and low productivity. So my sincere congratulations to Katrina. I'm very happy to take any questions further on down the line. I think it's really valuable work, and we are very, very pleased to be a semi-detached member of this thought. So thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Piers. Yeah, we've started to see some questions coming through on the chat. So what we'll do is I'll ask Will and James to make some opening comments, and then we'll come back and pick up some of those questions. So Will, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you very much to CCN for inviting me to speak this morning. And I would also warmly congratulate Katrina for her report and for her proposals, which I think are kind of much needed and fill a really important gap in this debate. I wanted to say a little bit about why I think this matters politically and economically, which is the kind of bread and butter of what we do at Onward, trying to think about the kind of changing political and economic environment that we find ourselves in, and then comment specifically on both the government's proposals and where Katrina's proposals kind of fill those gaps. So in terms of why this matters, both politically and economically, I mean, I think it's fair to say that this is the defining political and economic challenge of this government or this parliament, notwithstanding coronavirus, which clearly has had an extraordinary effect on the economy. We went into this crisis and we'll come out of it with very deep regional inequalities that are deeply linked to the challenge of improving places. We saw that the Prime Minister's first speech as Prime Minister in 2019 was on the subject of levelling up in Manchester, where he set out 4 key pillars of levelling up around livability, connectivity, culture, etc. We saw that in the general election campaign in 2019, the Conservative Party modelled the entire kind of message and narrative to the electorate around levelling up, opportunity and growth in places that perhaps have been deprived those things in the last few decades, and making it not just about kind of getting Brexit done, but also about using that moment as a moment of kind of national and specifically regional renewal. And we've also, I think, had two budgets that, while ostensibly focused on coronavirus, have actually done a lot to drive this message of levelling up and place-based change, whether that's through intracity regional transport funding, whether that's through changes to the Green Book, whether that's through the National Infrastructure Bank and some of the things that were in the recent budget, the Levelling Up Fund, the Community Ownership Fund, Community Renewal Fund. The government is doing a lot in this space. And I think the kind of important thing to say is that is not just a kind of political trick. That is the government genuinely trying to reverse several decades worth of economic and political change in certain parts of the country. We know from all of the economic statistics that the UK is one of the most regionally unequal countries in the world. If you line up every country in the OECD by the gap between their most and least productive regions, the UK is beaten only by Romania and Poland. We are not in particularly good company when it comes to regional imbalance. And if you look at some of the kind of changes that have happened over the last few decades, we see that this problem is getting worse. London was about the same size as the north of England in 2004. It is now 25% bigger in terms of GVA. So there's been a big shift and a kind of growing concentration in our economy that is, I think, deeply worrying and does require government to do some quite big things to change the direction of travel and to give people back some opportunities. So that's the kind of why this matters. And I think, as I say, it matters for both kind of political reasons. It's critical to this government's promise to the electorate at the last election, and indeed whether or not they'll succeed at the next. But it's also critical to the long-term economic future of the country. And I should just say that regional imbalances in national economies matter for national growth too. If we reduce some of the regional imbalances in the economy, then we will grow faster out of this pandemic. And the Treasury, I think, now accepts that view. So that's why it matters. How does planning reform and strategic planning specifically fit into it? Well, so firstly, I think the government does recognise, and it certainly did in the planning white paper last year, that the planning system is due an overhaul, and in some ways the planning system is making this problem worse. So the PM's words in the foreword of that report were, the planning system is beginning to crumble and the time has come to do what too many for too long have lacked the courage to do, tear it down and start again. So very clear statement of intent and a recognition that the planning system as currently constituted is a barrier to levelling up. And so this is critical. That was not just about cheaper homes either. It was about giving the people of this country the homes we need in the places we want to live at the prices we can afford. So it's not just about price or quantity, it's also about place. And I think since the publication of that white paper and the various debates and changes seen since, you've seen a kind of growing recognition from government that there is a need to link planning and housing reform to the levelling up agenda in a much more indelible way than has perhaps been the case previously, or certainly in some government communication. So you've obviously seen the changing of the allocation methodology. That was clearly about ensuring that it properly reflected bringing housing to the places we want to put housing. And there was also the changes to the 80-20 rule and various other things, which I think have reflected a kind of government recognition that they need to link those two things. But the big thing that's been missing up until now, I think, and I think Piers said this as well, has been the case for strategic planning and the government's views around how strategic planning fits into the wider planning framework. Bluntly, I think that was a deliberate omission because of wider conversations about devolution and kind of structural reform within local government, which are obviously ongoing. But I think there has been a desire from government to kind of grapple with this difficult and knotty question about how to introduce more strategic planning in government. And I think that stems from a kind of recognition that in the places where you do have more strategic planning, i.e. London, where we've had 20 years of much more strategic leadership and structural kind of unity around economic and spatial development, you have seen quite a lot of benefits accrue from that, and the ability to drive forward quite far-reaching change that perhaps hasn't been available in other parts of the country. So I think there is a need to do some of the things that Katrina sets out in her proposal. And I think, I mean, as you said, different people have different views about the level of spatial geography to do that. And Piers and I slightly disagree on this. I think kind of city regions and counties are probably the right strategic level to do a lot of this stuff. There might be some things that could be done at a larger level, but I think that irrespective of where you put it, that we should all recognise that districts are too small, LEPs are too unwieldy and underpowered in some ways, and that just doing it in the places that have mayors will kind of actually probably make the levelling up challenge harder, because those places will be able to do some big far-reaching productive change, and other places will be stopped from doing so. So I think you do need a universalist solution, and I think Katrina's proposals set out a good idea for that. Just the one question that I have, which I think is a question that government will be particularly interested in, just thinking how I would if I was back in my old job in number 10, which is, how do you really sharpen the accountability within the system that you propose? Because I think, with the best will in the world, growth boards or strategic development boards, or kind of however you construct them, boards that are accountable to their members and in some ways to government are not that necessarily that accountable to local people. And I think sharpening some of that democratic accountability in some way would, I think, be helpful in giving some of these new structures the legitimacy for taking some big far-reaching decisions about their place. But I do think something like a growth board, perhaps with sharpened accountability and greater kind of visible leadership, I think would be a sensible way forward. So that's a very quick run through of my thoughts, Tim. I'm very happy to come in.
Thank you. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Will. I mean, I think that whole issue around how we engage with local government with our communities and empower our communities is a real topic, you know, and maybe it's creating community networks and so on, but we must get involvement from communities, and you know, and we've seen that during the pandemic, how those communities come together, and the voluntary community faith sector and so on. So we need to build on that as well. Thank you. Can I now go to James? And James, perhaps when you're just making some opening comments, you could also comment on in your view, the kind of optimum spatial geography, because there seems to be a little bit of difference between all of you on that. But anyway, James, thank you.
Well, thanks very much. Well, I'll try and answer that question first of all, Tim, if that's okay, which is that we in the HBF don't have a view about the optimum spatial geography. I think our answer is that we would like to see some form of spatial planning come forward, and we're not particularly bothered what form that takes, but we do need strategic planning because it has many benefits. The ability, as you articulated, Tim, to coordinate provision of housing, employment, transport, infrastructure, waste, minerals, environmental objectives, and effectively over a longer term than we're doing at the moment. And that could be conducted at the regional scale along the lines of the One Powerhouse proposals, or sub-regional level, or through the form of or at the level of county councils. I think we just need to see some form of strategic planning, because we've been hampered, particularly in the house building industry, in terms of being able to bring forward large scale new settlements and extensions to places. First of all, I think it's important that we achieve full local plan coverage in England within the next 3 years, which is in line with the government's objectives outlined in its planning white paper. But we do recognise that there are real limitations to that. You know, they operate over very narrow geographic areas with limited regard to what is happening in adjacent local authorities. And it is this insularity that militates against the effective delivery of outcomes for our people, particularly meeting the housing needs. So we did used to do strategic planning in this country, but the regional strategies were abolished just as we were recovering from the financial crisis of 2008-9. And we had localism replacing top-down planning. Now, to a certain extent, the house building industry got on with it, and it wasn't too bad for the period from about 2011 to 2016. But very quickly, two big problems became very apparent. First, not all local authorities were willing to plan. We have very large gaps in the production of up-to-date local plans, especially in Greenbelt local authorities surrounding London, a problem recognised by the government in its planning white paper. And second, many of our major cities were struggling to accommodate housing needs. And these cities needed their neighbours to cooperate to allocate land to provide for these housing needs. And the NPPF 2012 base system really failed in this respect. The duty to cooperate, intended to instill planning collaboration, was really far too weak. A lot of conversations took place, but there was really very little by way of practical action. So the government does need to grapple with establishing a system of strategic planning to ensure our development needs are coordinated along lines that reflect housing market and functional economic area geographies. And Katrina's paper for the county council networks is a really valuable contribution to that debate. I mean, there are a number of models for strategic planning out there. Strategic planning has continued in various forms over the last 10 years. The London Plan, as Will refers to, is never abolished. This has provided an effective mechanism for keeping 35 local planning authority plans up to date. Even if it is a bit too insular, it tends to ignore relationships of wider southeast. But generally, the view of the HBF and its members is that it has been effective and addresses the problem referred to above, where you have local authorities reluctant to plan. Because the London Plan is part of the development plan system, as soon as it's adopted, and the GLA has been very good at keeping it up to date, then generally it updates key priorities and targets for the other 35 local planning authorities. We've also seen forms of joint planning carried out elsewhere in the country, which has been to a greater or lesser extent effective, very effective in Plymouth and South Devon and in Nottinghamshire. But the willingness of local authorities to collaborate on strategic planning has been weak on the whole. Even when the government has conferred powers on the mayoral combined authorities to prepare strategic plans, the results have been disappointing. Spatial plan preparation has been delayed continuously in Greater Manchester and has been hampered by politics in the Liverpool City region, the west of England equally. Meanwhile, in the West Midlands, which really needs spatial planning probably more than anywhere else to deal with the problem of Birmingham's unmet need and the unmet needs of Coventry and the Black Country, the mayor is resistant to the idea, recognising the fraught politics involved. Oxfordshire has also struggled to deliver its strategic plan on time. We've seen some encouraging news recently with the government's announcement about its intentions for the Oxford-Cambridge Arc and its intention to publish a spatial statement there, and we really like that. And it's interesting how the government's paper acknowledges the lack of institutional capacity within local government to deliver this major growth programme. I suspect that might just be a polite way of it saying there is a lack of political will within local government to actually do anything, and that's why they've had to intervene with this spatial statement. But what do we do with areas outside the ARC? I mean, the ARC certainly, the government's proposals there certainly suggest a way forward, but that's just for the ARC. So what do we do for those areas outside? And what would the HBF like to see? Well, we've recommended to government that the mayoral combined authorities, and we accept that they're imperfect, and we accept the issue about the geography that they're selected upon doesn't always seem sensible, and there will be gaps. But we think they should all be conferred spatial plan making powers. I mean, there is, the fact that they have elected mayors does address Will's point about accountability to the people, which I think is very important. And they do need to be powered up to the same level enjoyed by the Mayor of London, so that spatial plan making isn't held hostage by one or two authorities like Stockport and Greater Manchester. We know the political geographies, as I said, are imperfect, but at least it's a start. And then secondly, we would like the government to encourage the creation of more unitary authorities. Planning across 330 odd local authorities is too fragmented, ineffective, and waste resources. But ideally, we should have a reorganisation of local government, but we recognise that that might be politically more than the government's willing to confront at the moment. But at least an encouragement to create more unitary authorities might be a step forward. So I accept this is a bit of a patchwork of different mechanisms, and it's not ideal. The one powerhouse proposals are probably more cogent in terms of its mega city regions. We certainly like that idea, but it hasn't got much to do with land use planning. And of course, we are interested in land use planning and the allocation of land, and that's really where we come to the nub of really what's different with the county council networks proposals and what we support and where we differ. So we agree that a system of strategic planning is going to be very important to help deliver health outcomes and get us out of the recession. And we agree with Katrina that the Secretary of State should be involved in designating the geography of strategic planning advisory bodies. I think we're probably less in agreement about the proposed integrated strategic framework and the proposal that this shouldn't be statutory. We really need statutory plans, plans that are part of the development plan, in order for those to take effect and deliver real outcomes. And I'm not sure that these spatial advisory bodies should advise central government on local plan housing targets, unless it's merely about apportionment and the most sustainable directions for growth. I'm not necessarily sure they should be involved in discussion about what those are. I think that is an issue. The deciding what housing targets are for local authorities really is a nationally important issue that the Secretary of State should be involved in. But that's me. Those are my views, Tim. But congratulations very much to County Councils Network for grappling with this very important topic.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much. So, I mean, there's quite a lot of agreement, I think, in terms of the general approach and the need to look at spatial planning. Perhaps not so much agreement in terms of the size of that, whether that's looked at on a regional basis or at a county level. But at the end of the day, I mean, you've all made the point that the duty to cooperate didn't really work. It didn't really happen. Equally, we've got a government that wants to get on with simplifying the planning process and speeding it up. So it won't want to see any structures inserted into that process, I don't imagine, that would delay it. So is there any alternative but to have this the requirement to cooperate, to collaborate, enshrined in legislation? If it isn't, people are just going to ignore it, aren't they? So Katrina, let's see what your view on that is.
I think that the question that's interesting, James, that's saying statutory versus non-statutory, and the reason we went with non-statutory is it does, and the word non-statutory I think loses what we're actually talking about. It's just not part of the statutory development plan, but it would be a requirement by government to do so, in the same way that the ARC framework will not be part of the statutory development plan, but it doesn't make it any weaker in terms of its impact on local plans at the end of the day. So I think there's a system. Why we went with a system outside of the statutory development plan was to recognise that wider role that strategic planning has, and the flexibility we need, the resilience we need to be able to respond to changes over time. I just want to quickly touch on the geography. Regional planning, spatial planning has always been done at different spatial scales. When we had regional planning guidance, we also had structure plans. When we had regional spatial strategies, the most important part of a regional spatial strategy was the sub-regional element of that. And the reason we always have that is, and there's some questions there about Greenbelt and housing things, the reason we had that was because at a regional level, there are things that are better done at that scale, and a lot of these are addressed in the One Powerhouse report. There are things that are better done at a more local scale. So at a mega regional scale, you couldn't look at the Greenbelt and across places like Surrey or Hertfordshire and decide what the best spatial strategy is there, and therefore where you should be releasing Greenbelt and where you should be protecting it. And one of the core purposes of regional strategies and structure plans in the past was to set the general extent of the Greenbelt, and therefore take a lot of the heat out around every local planning authority having to review their own Greenbelt and deciding where they were going to release it. So things like Greenbelt, housing numbers, again, just to respond to James's point, what we've not proposed is that these integrated frameworks should, and the strategic planning advisory bodies should dictate to government what the numbers are. But if the government are allocating a number to each of these spatial strategic planning geographies, it is up to these areas to test the distribution, and therefore the distribution to the local plans, and inform that process about how that should be done and what the different spatial strategies would look like. So, these are, they're subtleties in the proposals, but really important subtleties in the proposals. So strategic planning scale, we're all agreed what's needed. I think having functions dictated at different scales at the mega region or regional or more localized, as we're proposing, is the way forward. It doesn't have, as long as they are aligned, as long as there's clear roles and functions at each level, and there is alignment in terms of these long-term investment priorities, that is what we need, and that goes right up to the national level as well. So I'm less worried about spatial geography. I think ours works, but it works within what One Powerhouse is saying as well.
Yeah, I think that's very much. There are things that can only really be addressed. So green issues. If you want to really focus on green issues, which everybody from the government right the way down, all the way through the political spectrum, green development is seen as vital. That can really only be achieved meaningfully on a mega regional scale. Similarly, energy, that will be another, power generation would be another area. I think to build on Katrina's point, the spatial plan, what the benefit of a spatial planning, the mega regional spatial planning function is that you have a discipline through which, a lens through which you can organize the region. Now, if you look at the Southwest region, there is a well-developed idea for the Western Gateway, which would link Bristol, broadly speaking, Bristol with Cardiff. That was as a growth corridor. There is no reason why the Southwest, now clearly that's two jurisdictions, there is no reason why the Southwest Regional Spatial Plan should not simply account for the reality of the Western Gateway or the Oxcam Arc, for that matter. So the beauty of the rigor of spatial planning on a mega regional scale is that it is very flexible to reflect these border issues and these anomalies, as one might call it, so something like the Western Gateway. I think on a political level, I was reading the government's Building Back Better document that they released this week, and was very excited to read it, and I was hoping I was going to be out of a job, actually. But the problem is, it's been beautifully written by somebody, probably one of Will's friends, somewhere still in number 10. It's been beautifully written, but it states exactly the status quo. It's going to be based around funds of various kinds. Now, we know what's happened to these funds very recently. This the Levelling Up Fund has already got into, astonishingly, got into hot water already. The problem with these funds, even the large ones, is that they will get atomized either through the more powerful city regions or simply atomized on a local level into roundabouts and pedestrian precincts. Vital as those are, that's not the primary purpose of levelling up. So I think what we're suggesting to number 10 is that you've made a commitment across the country to approach levelling up. And it's an honest commitment, and I do genuinely believe it. What we offer is something that the Prime Minister can physically point at as activity, not just money here and moving civil servants out of London, which I think we all know isn't really going to achieve very much. The spatial planning process offers a tried and trusted methodology that's worked in similar places across the world. And don't forget, actually, importantly, the New York Regional Association, which is very successful bit of spatial planning, is voluntary. Which is, if you understand anything about American politics, that is amazing that it's voluntary, considering the amount of money and the numbers of people involved. So I think that there is a lot to speak for the mega regions, especially in the north, actually, especially in the north, where you have unlocked potential, which is really going to be unlocked by a regional solution. And that, broadly speaking, I hate to generalize, is going to be transport, and that's going to be expensive. So I think looking at the mega regions is a really valuable lens. Also, and I'll just finish on this, I think the other benefit for number 10 is that this gives number 10 not only something to point towards that is meaningful and tangible, but it also offers, I think devolution is coming. And I think that governments of any stripe are going to be nervous about a highly emotional, politicized devolution process. We think that mega regional spatial planning offers a managed process towards some level of fiscal devolution. And I think that's quite valuable. The current government has, we hope, sorry, not we hope, I expect this government, because we're apolitical, to have a couple of electoral cycles. That's, I think most people agree on left and right about that. So that gives them quite a long time to deploy this kind of methodology. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Piers. We're getting near to the end of our time, but I just want to ask Will and James, in Piers' world, if I understand it right, doesn't that mean that effectively the Southeast is always going to be bound into London? I think those of us that live in the Southeast get slightly fed up of being London and the Southeast. The Southeast is a region in itself. What do you think about that, Will?
Yeah, so I agree with that, Tim, and I am not entirely comfortable with the concept of mega regions. I've read Piers's work and I've spoken to him before about this, and the reason why I'm slightly kind of nervous about the idea of mega regions is that I think they're to some degree artificial. They're not a kind of natural form of geography that citizens themselves would recognize or that history has bequeathed us. They're to some degree a kind of artificially constructed entity drawn on a map by someone on high, and like that's fine, and government does do that all the time, but I would argue that when government does that, those things typically don't work particularly well, and that you need to find geographies that not only work from a kind of economic geography perspective, but also work from a legitimacy and kind of existing boundary perspective. And so government, I suspect, will want to work through the existing structures that are within the UK. Now, there's nothing to stop, as Piers just said, those existing structures, whether that's counties or city regions, aggregating themselves up in voluntary partnerships to do the type of mega regional strategic planning that Piers is talking about. Like, there's no reason why the counties of the Southeast couldn't come together with London to create a Southeast mega region for strategic planning across that geography, but they should do so from the bottom up rather than from the top down, in my view. And they're far more likely to come up with productive results if they do that, and they'll have the legitimacy that comes from those existing structures if they do as well. So I think that my concern is with artificial construction of geographic regions rather than basing whatever intermediary structure we come up with to do strategic planning, which I think is vital, but rather than basing it on what exists already.
Thank you. And James, perhaps we can have a brief comment from you as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, London and the Southeast and the East of England region are a megacity region. You know, they are indivisibly related, and the Secretary of State, in his response to the London plan, has made it clear that the Mayor of London needs to work with the authorities of the wider Southeast and vice versa. Those commuting flows, they might change a bit as a consequence of the pandemic, but that is a structural issue. And the Ox Can corridor was originally conceived as a solution to some of London's overspill. So yes, you are indivisibly linked. In terms of the One Powerhouse proposals, and I like the idea of megacity regions. I think they're good, but they're very good for planning for transport, for utilities, for waste, and for environmental objectives. But they're probably of more limited use to the HBF and the house building industry in terms of planning for numbers. That's why we need statutory plans, spatial and local, that allocate land for housing, and that's the issue that local authorities do their utmost, particularly in the wider Southeast, to avoid. That, you know, they really try and avoid local plan production, and the government recognised that in its planning white paper, hence its reforms to try and outmaneuver them there, if I can put it that way. So, you know, we're looking at practical solutions, and that's why we agree that the mayoral combined authorities, not necessarily sensible in terms of the areas that they cover, but at least they're a practical first step. And I think it's a test to see whether there is the political will to do strategic planning. And then outside of that, as we've said, unitary authorities, I think, is really the way to go. Those are the building blocks for strategic planning.
I'm sure we'll hear more about that with the government's proposed white paper on devolution in due course. I'm afraid that's all we have got time for now. So can I thank Piers, Will and James very much for their contributions, and particularly to Katrina for all of her hard work and indeed her expertise getting us to this point, not just recently, but indeed for all the years I've known Katrina. She's been a big advocate of spatial planning. So as far as CCN is concerned, we'll continue to engage with MHLCG and kind of sector stakeholders, put forward our proposals. After this webinar, we'll send round some resource for you to have a look at, so infographics and a promotional video, which, you know, if you have the time, please do have a look at that. You can use that information on your social media platforms. We'll also be sending a joint letter to the Housing Minister with organisations that support the principles that we have talked about here. So if you've any thoughts, and indeed if you would like to, or you're willing to sign up to that letter, please do let us know, and we'll send out details around that in due course. So on that note, can I thank you all very much for attending this morning. I hope you found it useful, and I'm sure the debate will continue. Enjoy the rest of the day and the weekend. Thank you very much.